Well, we're recording our sessions this morning and for the next 2 weeks. Welcome to a wonderful 3-week session for the next 3 weeks on Tuesdays at 11 a.m. Pacific Daylight Time. We are going to be privileged, and I mean that sincerely because I have studied with him for many years past, with Professor Dr. Paul Liptz, coming live to us from Israel. Who was going to present 3 very important discussions, lectures, and learning about Israel in the Middle East. Today, we are going to be talking about Judaism, Christianity, and Islam in the holy and unholy city of Jerusalem. That will be our topic for this morning. But let me share a little bit with you about our incredible teacher this morning. Paul is a social historian and was on the Tel Aviv University faculty for 40 years, teaching both graduates and undergraduate students in the Department of Middle East and African History, and also in the International School, where he dealt with a wide range of topics. His main interests are history of pre-state Israel, the Yishuv, the modern state of Israel, and Arab women and nationalism in the Middle East. And where I met Paul first was that he taught graduate students at the Hebrew Union College in Jerusalem for 25 years, as well as in the conservative movement seminary. And he's taught us a whole variety of things, from Jewish history, Israeli society, contemporary Middle East. In the Israeli Army Reserves, he's lectured officers and non-commissioned officers on non-military issues. He's still active in Israel and involved in lots of academic and educational fields. He's a world traveler, and originally he was born in what was then Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe, and came as a volunteer to Israel just one day before the Six-Day War on June 4th, 1967, and he has remained to this day. Paul, we are delighted that you're with us here at Congregation Kol Ami in West Hollywood, and I'm delighted to see you again, and I'm so looking forward to today's learning with you and for the next couple weeks. And just a quick word, you all are muted. If you have questions that occur as the lecture's going on, conversation's going on, put them in the chat, and then we will unmute towards the end for Q&A with Professor Liptz. Without further ado, Paul.
Good. Hi. Thank you very much. Good morning. This is always exciting for me. Every now and again, I get an invitation, and it's just for one session. So that's not such good fun. To know that there are 3 sessions is absolutely delightful, and we'll get to know each other. By the way, I think on the last slide, you'll see my email, and you're welcome to write to me if you want. If there are any questions that come out that you haven't managed to put into the chat, I'm always happy to carry on the conversation. We're dealing with a topic today, which is a mind-boggling topic. A course on Jerusalem should really be about a 3-year full-time study. It is such a complex arena, and I'm going to try and divide it up into the 3 subgroups, the Jews and Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And to try and give what I think is a somewhat different perspective, what most people normally look at Jerusalem as, and that is I'm looking at it as an historian and not so much from a theological point of view. So I think for some people it might be a little bit different from some of the perspectives that you've normally heard or read about. So we'll start now, and I'll try and keep within the specified time period. Are you seeing a please move this window? Is that appearing in your screen? It looks okay, fine. It's on, just sometimes on mine, something comes up. So what are we looking at? What is the sort of the big picture that we can say about this very, very interesting city? Firstly, the historical approach is obviously very different. But what can we say about Jerusalem? There's so many things. So just let me put out some concepts. Jerusalem has been destroyed twice, besieged 23 times, attacked 52 times, and captured and recaptured 44 times. So this is the problem. A theological topic in a very, very complex realpolitik kind of environment. The importance of Jerusalem is clearly that we have three groups, three religious groups, who all regard it as an extremely important place. And therefore, what we're talking about, in a sense, on the one sense, is a holy city, and on the other, in the other sense, is when religion and politics get so deeply involved with each other, sometimes, unfortunately, it turns into a different kind of story. The Jerusalem brings about many phenomena, and I just want to mention one very unusual aspect that we have, which is called the Jerusalem syndrome, which I've actually experienced on a number of occasions. Jerusalem syndrome tends to come to a large extent with Christians, but not only. And what happens is that when they're in Jerusalem, they go through this very complex psychological situation. And I remember sitting with the Israeli police, and they asked me, you know, what do we do with these people who suddenly start acting in this very strange way? It's a psychotic kind of a situation. And my advice to them was, unlike what we might expect from a policeman, and they thought, you know, they should take these people to the local jail, I said, you have to deal with them very, very carefully and sensitively, because it is an emotive event. And this is what happens. Jerusalem is emotive, Rome is emotive, Mecca is emotive, and essentially when this is the story that we're talking about. Let's start off with the early Jewish history, and I'll go through the Jewish story, onto the Christian story, and then onto the Islamic story. So from a Jewish perspective, it's a kind of an interesting aspect that we have to look at. On the one hand, Judaism and Jerusalem go together so closely for particular periods of history, although, as we'll see later on, Muslims can actually claim more time in the city than we can as Jews. However, in Tanakh, just how is the city mentioned? And just to take some of the 50 different names, Jerusalem itself is mentioned 656 times, 150 times for Zion or Zion, and 34 times for the city of David. It is everywhere. How could you possibly read Tanakh without being so absolutely aware of how close Yerushalayim is to the heart of the Jewish people? From an historical perspective, it obviously has major events, one with the 11th century BCE with King David, that leads on to Solomon. The famous Mount Moriah binding of Isaac comes up there. In a later period, 539 BCE, there's the return to Babylon, from Babylon. Then we get to the Second Temple period, and by 70 CE, the Second Temple period is over. It's a powerful story. And if in a sense it could end there, well, this presentation would be somewhat short, I presume. But it doesn't end there. And the fact that the Jewish people decided that Jerusalem was so vital to them, and it appeared so much in our written sources, and here I'm referring to early sources that we all know, it carries on all through history, that really might have left the city somewhat on the sideline. But we do have a well-known phenomenon in Israel in particular, and we find it in other countries as well, that where one group has been, and if that group describes a particular place as being important, other groups pick up those ideas as well. So we have a combination of different stories, different narratives, which very much take the early Jewish story as being very important. The historians, by the way, can argue that Jerusalem really wasn't the best geographical site to become a center of a newly forming religious group. But be it as it may, that is exactly what happened. I think what's particularly interesting about Jerusalem from the Jewish perspective is the fact that there is a geographical, historical period which is followed by a deeply philosophical and theological period, the desire to return. Next Year in Jerusalem, in all its different ways, really expresses a remarkable feeling that the Jewish people who were very far away from Jerusalem, who many of them had almost no knowledge of what it really was, had this ongoing yearning to return to the city. And I must say that we as a family spent some 45 years living in that city, and I can well understand how over the ongoing generations, the Jewish people yearned for Jerusalem and prayed for Jerusalem and hoped they would come to Jerusalem. However, as some of the realists of Jewish history point out, next year in Jerusalem maybe didn't quite mean next year, but perhaps something a little bit further extended than that actual defined period of time. If we jump forward many, many hundreds of years to get to the Zionist period, we might initially imagine that Zionism, having decided not to go to any other part of the world, not Uganda, not Australia, not Argentina, not any of the 21 possible suggestions, the fact that they decided to come back to Zion is a very important issue. If you're coming back to Zion, to Eretz Israel, surely Jerusalem is going to be central. And here comes an interesting contradiction. And all history, I would suggest, is filled with contradiction. In this particular case, in a visit in 1898, Theodor Herzl was repelled by the filthy old city. I must be honest, when I came to Jerusalem and visited the old city in June 1967, it wasn't all that pretty and nice, and it did have quite a smell to it as well. But the early Zionists, and we have Nachum Sokolov, a major Zionist thinker, who made the following comment: the point of gravity has shifted from the Jerusalem of the religious schools to the farms and agricultural schools. Therefore, Zionism large, not every Zionist, of course, but certainly something in the region of 70 or 80% of the early Zionists did not regard Jerusalem, that place that we had been dreaming about for so many centuries, as the focus of their interest, but rather the kibbutz. The new Jew, that new Zionist Jew, was certainly not waiting for the Messiah. Something had changed, and Zionism brought destiny into the hands of real people. So here we have an interesting contradiction and ambivalence of how we should look at Jerusalem at various periods of time. Jerusalem, by the way, was almost not to be in the hands of the Jewish people. By the November 1947 Declaration of the United Nations, it was decided that Jerusalem would be corpus separatum, a separate entity, and Jerusalem, and by the way, would be connected to Bethlehem, and it wouldn't be part of the Jewish state. From a Jewish perspective, those Zionists who had not been all that interested in visiting the city suddenly changed their perspective, and led by David Ben-Gurion, realized that the Jewish state without Jerusalem as the capital, or if not the capital, as a future capital, should really be something that one should work on. And as a result of the Israel's War of Independence between November 1947 and January 1948, West Jerusalem came under the control of the State of Israel, and East Jerusalem was under the control of Jordan. Unfortunately, Jordan, which is a great important ally of Israel today, didn't really relate to the religious sites in East Jerusalem, the Jewish religious sites in East Jerusalem, with a great deal of respect. And here we find in the old city the destroyed Chorva synagogue, which has since been renovated. And when Israel returned, as I did, to Jerusalem in June 1967, we realized that there was a great deal of renovation that had to be carried out. The Six-Day War brought yet another change in the situation of Jerusalem. From a period of 19 years, being in a divided city, where, as many of the Jerusalemites would point out, Jerusalem, the old city, the Western Wall, could only be looked at from one or two sites, and people would stand, Jerusalemites would stand on an area, Abu Tor, just outside the old city walls, and look into Jerusalem from afar. I think no one would have imagined during those 19 years that there would be a dramatic change in the relationship of the state of Israel towards Jerusalem, but that clearly came about during the Six-Day War, when in the dramatic events of that period, with all the complications that we understand today, East Jerusalem, the whole of Jerusalem, was under Israeli control. And in June 1967, the city was annexed and the whole city came under Israeli control, by the way, not to the agreement of a very significant part of the world. The old city that I saw in June 1967 looked exactly like this. I so remember it. A group of us from Southern Africa at that time, arrived 4 days after the end of the Six-Day War. There had been an Arab, a Palestinian building area over here. It had been knocked down. The bulldozers were there. Bulldozers were there. The people had been moved out, and the Western Wall, as we see in June 1967, looked very much like that. The decision of the Jerusalem municipality was very interesting. The well-known mayor, Teddy Kollek, who was in charge of the city from 1965 to 1993, very much wanted Jerusalem to be a city of partnership between the Israelis and the Palestinians. And he invited them to join the municipality. He couldn't make any broader political decisions, but he certainly could decide what would happen with the municipality. The overwhelming number of Palestinians, Muslim, by and large Muslim Palestinians, who are the majority of that population, decided that they wanted nothing to do with the Jerusalem municipality. From their point of view, and I think I can understand their perspective, they felt that as soon as they voted in the Jerusalem elections, not as Israeli citizens, but as residents of the city of Jerusalem, they would be, in a sense, giving back the city or giving over the city to the Jewish state. And that they absolutely refused to do. So what we're actually finding there is that as a result of the non-participation of the Palestinians in Jerusalem, in the decision of Jerusalem, East Jerusalem was poorly developed. And in the many, many years that we lived in that city, it always pained me when I would go into East Jerusalem. The division between West and East Jerusalem was not a division of a barrier, but a vision of a well-developed Western city and a poorly developed Eastern city, of which one reason, certainly not the only reason, was that if you want to get your city developed, you have to have an influence in City Hall. The story of Jerusalem is filled with ups and downs. One was the 1996 opening of the Western Wall tunnels, which brought about tremendous reaction. And very much, as we all remember, in the modern period, 2019, the decision of the American government under former President Donald Trump to move the US Embassy from Tel Aviv, lovely big building over there, to Jerusalem. And a few years ago, the new embassy, far away from where the old consulate was finished in Jerusalem. The regulations say, and here we're getting into the complexity of Israeli politics, the regulations say, in an agreement with the Jordanian government, and we'll see this coming up a little later as well, is that Jews are allowed to go up to the Temple Mount, that Temple Mount which is filled with complex questions, but are allowed to go up there and not to pray. And on the several occasions that I've gone up to the Temple Mount, as we would come through the entrance, the Waqf, the officials, the Muslim officials would say, you're welcome to walk around the Temple Mount area, but no praying. However, that regulation is not always carried out by Israeli Orthodox people, and that in itself always causes problems. What are the last decades about? Well, many ups and downs. Gush Imonim, the right-wing settler movement, planned to blow up the Temple Mount in 1984. And that would enable the Jewish people to rebuild the temple, and that in itself would be part of the coming of the Messianic period. We have the Temple Institute in the Old City, a fascinating place, which has all the investments and all the components of what is believed to have been in the temple itself, in the traditional temple, and they're getting ready for the whole of the Temple Mount to come over to Israeli control. We look within Israeli politics, and as I mentioned, Jerusalem is as much religion as politics, to see what the former Minister of Jerusalem Affairs, by the way, in the Israeli parliament, in the Israeli ministry realm, there's always a minister for Jerusalem Affairs explaining the importance of the city. The famous Natan Sharansky, in that position, wrote, the Temple Mount is more important than peace. Here we begin to understand the complexity of the city. Just a moment on the changing nature of the city. We see that from 1844, there was the high number of Jews as compared with non-Jews. And in 1990, there are other figures, but I prefer this figure because I know it's to be absolutely correct. 72% of the population of Jerusalem are Jewish, and the rest are non-Jewish. We well know, as Reform Jews, the tensions that Jerusalem brings up within the wider Jewish people. The complexity within Jerusalem, I'm sure many of you are aware. Living in the city for so long, over 40 years, it was just an ongoing story of the enemy that we used to be most aware of was in most cases the enemy within our own people. And it covers many sections. The most active, and some people would describe it rather as violence, is this group called the Jerusalem Faction. They are the #1 civil disobedience crowd at the moment within the ultra-Orthodox camp. But the ultra-Orthodox camp is very interesting, and we might find here something which we didn't quite expect. Here we have the comments of 2 ultra-Orthodox rabbis, the Sephardi Shas chief rabbi, spiritual leader of the time. He said to the United Arab Emirate envoy, so interesting discussion, that Jews should not enter Temple Mount because it should be of no concern to Jews. This is based on the idea that because the Holy of Holies is somewhere up there on the Temple Mount, and it's not quite clear exactly where it is, Jews should never be in a position where they're walking over the area where the Holy of Holies was. That's where the Sephardim are. Where are the Ashkenazim, once again from the ultra-Orthodox camp? The head of the United Torah Judaism Ashkenazi party said to the then Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, the Temple Mount was destroyed because of our sins. I ask you to keep the Temple Mount closed to Jews. So here we have to understand the complexity of those groups in Israel who define themselves as religious. I see myself as religious, but not by how most Israelis would look at me. How could it possibly be? Here we have the difference. The ultra-Orthodox officially say, don't go up to the Temple Mount. The modern Orthodox, as we've seen, Tisha B'Av, the former Tisha B'Av, are up there in their thousands. We within the Reform and Conservative movements are most concerned with access to the Temple Mount. And this brings in this very dramatic story, which I'm sure all of you are aware of, where the women of the wall, and here we see the significant leadership of American, Israeli, and world leadership. Here we see a bat mitzvah, and I think that might be Rabbi Eager.
Well, it's not actually, Paul. It's the CCAR convention in
Oh, that's
2017.
CCAR. But is that you over there?
It is me.
It is you. Wow,
that's when I was president of the conference.
Oh, wow, wonderful. I hadn't paid attention. Mazal tov. So here we find we are over there in different situations. Here we have these young ultra-Orthodox shouting out. I won't even try to repeat what some of them say. And here we find some of the battles, in this particular case, women at the wall and Haredi and modern Orthodox women fighting over there. It's depressing. This is all within the Jewish world. Let's go over to Christianity. Christianity deals with Jerusalem in a slightly different way. Essentially, Jerusalem, or at least theoretically, essentially, Jerusalem is the heavenly Jerusalem. However, we'll find that there are many contradictions to this idea, which I sometimes hear when I'm meeting Christian people around the world. I have heard on a number of occasions when I'm in Europe or in the United States, where Christian people will tell me, well, you know, we're not really so interested in the earthly Jerusalem. We're interested in the heavenly Jerusalem. To be honest, I would disagree with that approach, because as we find through history at various times, the earthly Jerusalem has become extremely important to Christianity as well. The big moment, obviously, where the whole nature of Christianity and the Middle East changes is with Emperor Constantine, who converts to Christianity and gets the empire to essentially convert as well. This brings a whole new change. As soon as the Roman Empire perceived itself as a Christian empire, and we know Rome as being the center of Christianity, we immediately find physical presence in Jerusalem becomes much more important. For much of the time, at least in the early period, the temple area, the area which is so much in the news until today, was a city dump. However, it's very interesting that only the Muslims, unlike the Christians, really did something about it. We'll see that a little while later. What's really going on? And that facts on the ground are extremely important. With all these vast number of sub-Christian groups, you people know it as well as I do, vast numbers of groups, some of them very small, the Roman Catholic group are very large. Really, in reality, all would like a little bit of territory, and for many reasons. And just to take one of the explanations that one can find, is that cemeteries, there aren't enough cemeteries for the Christian people to be buried. And so what you often have, and it's very positive, you'd have a number of groups, for example, in certain parts of Jerusalem, in Emek Rephaim, there's a cemetery where a number of Christian groups combine to use the same cemetery. The big moment of where Christianity really tried to get its feet on the ground are obviously the Crusader period. What are the Crusaders all about? And I found in the Biblical Archaeological Society journal a powerful comment. Crusades was one of the most romantic, chaotic, cruel, passionate, bizarre, and dramatic episodes in history. Well, that's quite an expression. We find that the Crusades are a major story in itself. People very much believed that, as Pope Urban II pointed out, that if you came to Jerusalem as part of the Crusaders, your sins would be absolved. 1099, they conquer the city, and the story goes that the killing of thousands of Jews and Muslims in 2 days was so high that the blood reached the level of the horses' knees. very powerful period. The Crusader presence was essentially for 90 years until 1187, when Salah ad-Din, the Druze leader of the group within the Muslim context, took over Jerusalem and acted in the very, very cruel way, powerful way of executing all 200 of the Templar and Hospitaller Knights. Those were the two sections of the Catholic Church that were particularly involved in the story of Jerusalem, fulfilling different tasks. As we have the tensions within Judaism, so we have tensions within Christianity. From the 4th century onwards, we're having Christian pilgrimages. And as soon as you have a pilgrimage, those people from their particular sect, group, subgroup, want permanent representation. They want their feet on the ground. The issue becomes more difficult in the various stages of inter-Christian tensions of 451, and certainly in the 11th century with the division of the Eastern, the Greek Orthodox churches, and the Western, later the Roman Catholic churches. By the way, that very issue that we're talking about many, many hundreds of years ago is still totally relevant today. As one speaks more and more, and over the years I've had fascinating conversations with Christian clergy people, they sort of away from the media, so to speak, and I would ask, what are the serious challenges facing you? They clearly always put problems that they have with the Israeli government, but as the conversations go on, quite quickly the topic moves to something else, and that is the tensions within themselves. These delicate kind of issues where in the public arena we have a sense of unity, and in the private arena we understand, as by virtue of the fact that Jerusalem is a holy city and also an unholy political city, that you're going to have these particular kind of tensions. As Jerusalem becomes more open in history and more people are able to get to Jerusalem, which, by the way, until about 200 years ago was a difficult challenge. But certainly within the last 200 years, when you've had more and more people coming in, you begin to see that these inner tensions tend to exist. To just take one particular unusual point is within the Greek Orthodox Church. The Greek Orthodox clergy are expatriates. They're from Greece. The local members of the Greek Orthodox Church are Arabs. And for years and years, there have been these difficult kind of tensions between a essentially foreign expatriate laity with local Greek Orthodox Arab Palestinian members. There's also the tremendous, tremendous issue of who are the power brokers. We have 3 patriarchs, 5 Catholic patriarchal vicars, 4 archbishops, and 2 Protestant bishops, all somehow or other in this very, very small city of Jerusalem. The churches of Jerusalem, for those of you who spent time here, know absolutely beautiful. The Church of All Nations and the Church on the Mount of Olives, both of them beautiful churches. And around the city of Jerusalem, what you're beginning to find, and this is really to update this issue of Christianity, the number of Christians in Jerusalem, and this is true of Bethlehem as well, and by the way, true of the whole Middle East, the number of Christians is declining for many reasons, which this isn't quite the arena to go into the details. For many reasons, Christians are leaving not only Israel and the Palestinian areas, but pretty much every country in the wider Middle East. Where are we today in some of the more modern events? An important decision was made in 1757 when Israel, what we call Israel today, Palestine of the time, was the decree of the Ottoman Sultan, who made some sort of sense of how things should work. By the way, the Ottomans were very much aware that when you get too involved in someone else's religion, you're probably never going to get out of it. So they had a very sensible way of dealing with issues. And rather than dealing with the inner workings of any particular other religious group, we're talking here of the dhimmi, the so-called protected people, Jews and Christians. They would really deal with the main authorities, trying not to get too involved. And this was pretty much what the papacy initially decided, not wanting to have any relationship with the state of Israel, but that has changed very much in the last 20 years or so. With the arrival, for example, of Russian-speaking Jews coming to this country, who some are Jewish and some are Christians, we have new church groups coming in to serve those people. The interesting part of Jerusalem, which I think is not well known, is that a tremendous amount of property is actually in the hands of the various churches. And what happens in most cases, and just for example, to take the suburb of Jerusalem, Rehavia, the comfortable suburb neighborhood right next to the center of the city, a significant part of Rehavia is actually owned by the churches and is rented out on a long-term basis to the municipality and to local citizens. Churches have always had a negative clientele within Jewish society. And here we have the interesting story of the Mormon Brigham Young University, where there was a tremendous amount of opposition. Fortunately, Mayor Teddy Kollek managed to work through some of the complications of how to deal with the Brigham Young University. And one of it is a clear agreement made by the municipality and the university that there would be no attempt to convert the Jewish people. The university, by the way, is beautiful, up on near Mount Scopus, up on the hill over there, beautiful place, and something which I still remember, Sunday evening concerts where we would sit in this beautiful amphitheater looking over the lights of Jerusalem as we could attend on a once or twice a month basis, wonderful free concerts. That was good stuff. The fascinating scene of all is the Church of this Holy Sepulchre. Well, the Ottomans, who I said were very interested in trying to work out how groups should work with each other, in the mid-19th century, came out with a remarkable program on how to deal with the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the central site, the site of the crucifixion, the burial, and the resurrection of Jesus. Each part of the Holy Sepulchre, and if you haven't ever been there on a guided tour, I suggest you do that. It is absolutely fascinating, complex as anything, and it's filled with anecdotes. There's an immovable ladder, a ladder which goes up about there, which you can't move because the different groups will be angry. The fear that the different groups would fight each other and open and close the church doors, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre doors, was so problematic that the Ottomans decided that the keys to the main door, this door over here, would be in the hand of two Muslim families. Well, I've had some wonderful chats with those two families, and I asked them, isn't it a great honor that you hold the keys to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre? Well, there was an elderly gentleman who was given the duty to do that with one of the families, and he whispered in my ear, he said, you might think it's a great honor, but I can tell you, I hate waking up so early in the morning and going to bed so late, and I wish these Christians would work it out for themselves. So that's just what he said, and that was certainly unofficial. There's a contentious discussion of whether the crucifixion and the most holy site of Christianity is the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, although Protestants in an earlier period, much less know, would say the garden tomb. pray for peace, pray for the peace in Jerusalem. This is the area which is considered most holy. It's a wonderful place to feel the peace of Jerusalem, although within the church world itself, the Garden Tomb doesn't really have so much status. Let us move as the last section to look at Islam. The relation of Islam to Jerusalem is complex, but very, very important. And I think I sometimes get very worried by Israelis who misunderstand the essence of the contact of Islam together with Jerusalem. It is true that the direct mention of Jerusalem only appears in one place in the Quran, and that's Surah 17, chapter, verse number 1. What we are still, sorry, my apologies. What we, oops, yeah, here we are. What we're seeing here is in verse 17, chapter 17, verse 1, my apologies. The idea is that Muhammad goes to heaven. That is the only fully defined sentence. However, what is not well understood is that Islam is very much influenced by traditions, Fadail al-Quds. These are traditions which appear after the Quran, which explain the tremendous emotional importance of Jerusalem for the Muslim people, and the fact that in the future day of judgment would actually be in Jerusalem. Jerusalem, however, for Islam, as with Christianity and as with Judaism, is much more than a religious site. And it's become increasingly a site of political importance. The 7th century Caliph Umar cleansed the Temple Mount, and in his favor, he permitted the Christians to retain their holy places, and he invited 70 Jewish families to return and to go back to the Jewish quarter. Since then, there were major developments, and by the end of the 7th century, the growth of the Dome of the Rock and Al-Aqsa, the whole large area of the Temple Mount, the Islamic presence is very, very powerful. Why do I mention that? Because in the modern context of Israel, what comes up again and again are, particularly less so with the Christians, but very much the tension between Judaism and Islam in terms of who does the Temple Mount belong to. And I think one must admit that there is a clear issue of completing narratives. But in terms of the physical development of Jerusalem, the 7th century and later the 16th century brought about a tremendous amount of development. The large Jerusalem, which we see today, is a distinct extension of what existed in an early period. And for Muslim Palestinians, my apologies, for Muslim Palestinians, the loss of Al-Quds, their word for Jerusalem, is an unthinkable catastrophe. We have to realize from the Islamic perspective, not talking about all Muslims, but from the, let's call it the official theological perspective, the idea that the dhimmi, a protected people, is physically around the Temple Mount. By the way, not in the Temple Mount, but physically around the Temple Mount is very, very problematic. And that was one of the reasons why the government in 1967 allowed Jordan to essentially be in control of the Temple Mount, and the Waqf, the officials who work on the Temple Mount, are actually employees of the Jordanian government. What is the overall, very quick story of Islamic presence? From 636 over here to essentially 1967, it has essentially been under the Muslims. To speak about being a holy, peaceful city, Jerusalem, the city of peace, doesn't really gel well with the historical analysis, because at each stage, Umayyads, the Abbasids, the Fatimids, Saladin himself, Mamluks, and the Ottomans, each of this came about through war. And therefore, the title which I've used of Jerusalem, the holy and unholy city, really tries to indicate that within each group, within Judaism, within Christianity, and within Islam, the reality is that Jerusalem tragically has been a place of conflict, be it physical conflict or political conflict. 1967, there was a united Jerusalem. For the first time, the city seemed to be one city. But as I mentioned earlier, East Jerusalem has been poorly developed, and the residents from East Jerusalem do not get involved with the city municipality, as I made clear earlier. To get to the end of the presentation, we have a vast number of think tanks in this country. I often believe that there are more think tanks than Israeli citizens. I've sat on some of them, and there's a lot of talk. One of the people who really has tried so hard to come to some sort of decision on how do you deal with the city, who does it really belong to, is a modern Orthodox Jew, Professor MENACHEM KLEIN over here. He used to, I know him from when I taught at the Hebrew University for a short period many years ago, and after he moved to BAR-ILAN University. He has been battling with this issue for decades. And here we have in one of his articles, a very, very optimistic, we might define it as, comment on how things could really work out. Without going into all the nitty-gritty, and it's part of a longer article, he speaks about friendly crossings. He speaks about two sides should administer the border of this open city, so to speak. And he believes that the sovereignty of the whole city should be divided between Israel and Palestine. I think I would like to believe that that was possible. Looking how things really develop in most occasions would indicate that I would say to Menachem, you know, I wish you were correct, but I'm not quite sure it's possible. But let it, in terms of a tough session, it's tough for me, and I think it's tough for many of you, let me try and present a different kind of perspective. And this is a lovely little poem that a Jewish 7th grade child wrote in terms of the city. When people say that everyone lives together in Jerusalem, it's more than just words. Such different people. And that's the beauty of it. Because besides the Western Wall stands the Muslim mosque. Jerusalem is sacred to the Arabs too. And they also have so much to show. The mosques, the market, and the bakeries. These are things that typify them. Arabs and Jews live alongside each other. So in some way, Jerusalem is a symbol of peace. We can live together. I will stop sharing and go into questions. Thank you very much.
Wow, thank you for that marvelous understanding and overview of the three main religions of Jerusalem. We're gonna open it to questions. We're gonna start though with one in the chat. Robert Olish asked, does the Quran say that Jerusalem belongs to the Jews and Mecca and Medina belong to the Muslims?
No.
Well,
The tradition, the Here we caught, it's a very interesting question. The Quran certainly doesn't say that Jerusalem is the city of the Jews, because in terms of Islam, there are 3 holy cities, all of which should in fact be Islamic cities. This, by the way, is a reality, a political reality, which we have to recognize. So from an Islamic perspective, if you read Islamic sources, Islamic theological sources, they would say we have 3 holy cities. There is a priority. It's Mecca first, because that's where Muhammad was for a short period at the end of his life, and that's where the Kaaba, the holy center of Islam, is. Medina, where he lived. But because Jerusalem is mentioned in the Quran as having this very important component of Muhammad going to the heavens and then coming down, and that's where the redemption will be, from an Islamic perspective, Jerusalem is also theirs. Now, what's happened is, we see from the presentation, the state of Israel and the Jewish people do not accept this, and as kind of a compromise, the Temple Mount was in a sense handed over to them to allow them to control it in 1967, realizing the complexity of what would happen if Israel was physically present on the Temple Mount. After all, by the way, although we Jews think that the Western Wall is what it's all about, that's because we haven't got what we theoretically might want to have, which is the Temple Mount. So this is where it is. And, you know, in history, we constantly use the expression completing narratives. And this is just one of the stories where you can listen to both sides and you can absolutely agree with both versions. And yet that doesn't really bring about a great deal of peace and quiet.
Other questions that, if you want, anybody have a follow-up question or another question that they'd like to ask, a burning question?
I have a question if there's time, but
go ahead, Rabbi.
Thank you so much again, Professor Liptz, for joining us. It's such an honor to learn from you. I'm wondering, you were talking about the phrase, the next year in Jerusalem, and this idea of Jews always looking towards Jerusalem. I'm wondering if historically we do have evidence of a similar sort of mass movement to Jerusalem, to actually physically returning. I mean, we hear of Yehuda Halevi, you know, the famous medieval poet, spending the latter years of his life there. We hear of the Rambam of Maimonides visiting the Holy Land and seeing the sites. But in my learning, I haven't heard of a mass movement returning to Jerusalem similar to what we see with the successive aliyot of the early Zionists. I'm just curious to see if there were similar analogs.
No, there weren't. You know, even when we look at the period of the 4 holy cities, Hebron, Tzfat, Tiberias, and Jerusalem, we can't really say that Jerusalem was the #1 choice. At various stages through Jewish history, you know, going back to the early period of Yavne, for example, after the end of the Second Temple, it really wasn't a mass return. The numbers have been very small. It's actually very recent that you see that particular groups are deciding to go in a substantial number to Jerusalem. And one group, what we must obviously mention, are Americans. You can go through parts of Jerusalem, and the lingua franca is actually English. But there hasn't been a focus, I think not only for theological reasons, but for practical reasons. It's a small city. It's a city filled with tension. Having lived there for 40 years, experiencing all the ups and downs of the various factions fighting for their story, I think people in the kind of the more realistic mode would say, you know, I would like to visit Jerusalem, but I'm quite happy to live somewhere else. And I think that has in fact been the overall perspective. You know, for more than that, by the way, the Jerusalem municipality is always worried that young people, particularly who aren't part of Orthodox or ultra-Orthodox, are leaving Jerusalem. We lived there, and our family, as Reformed Jews, while we were still living there, all our children had left Jerusalem and gone to other places. So I think this is really the reality of it, that it's a powerful theological, spiritual center, a place where one has to go and feel. But in terms of day-to-day living, it's quite a difficult story. So I think that is the kind of an overall perspective that one might make.
Wonderful. Well, Paul, we're going to look forward to seeing you next Tuesday at 11 a.m. Pacific time. You'll be coming to us from Jerusalem again. And everybody, the next week's topic is War of Swords and War of Words, how to have a peace, P-I-E-C-E, of peace. So I hope that you'll all return next Tuesday. Paul, we're so thrilled to have you with us for the next couple of weeks. Thank you again for a really illuminating session today on Yerushalayim. And friends, join us online. Services are Friday night at 6:30 Pacific time. You can find us on Facebook or YouTube or our temple website at kol-ami.org. We'll be celebrating Pink Shabbat with breast cancer awareness this Friday night with an extraordinary speaker from City of Hope. And then on Saturday, my Torah study class, Prophetic Torah, meets at 10 a.m. Pacific time. That's on Zoom, and you can register for that again on our temple website. Thanks for being with us, and we look forward to seeing you both online and in person. Paul, we'll see you next week.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, everybody. Take care.
Thank you so much.